Welcome, everybody. My name is Haresh Singhani. This is Conversations with Haresh. We'll be talking to people of varied backgrounds, covering various topics. I'm very excited to be able to share these with you. The goal is to increase curiosity and empathy amongst all of us to help us grow professionally and personally at all levels. And of course, we also want to make sure that this is fun. So thank you again, and we'll look forward to having you. Good morning, Chris. Thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I mentioned about my project with this podcast before. The basic idea is exploring interesting topics and interesting people's journeys to fundamentally drive empathy and curiosity, and maybe to some extent, maybe not as much, but also compassion and tolerance. So that's kind of like the Uber vision. Yeah, empathy and curiosity is kind of they've been core values or drivers for me to do this project. And as you may be aware, we've talked to different people on this podcast. Thanks for being here, and I hope you're doing well. The holidays are upon us.
Getting there, yeah. Holidays, the end of the year, thinking about the new year and what all we might accomplish together.
Great. We'll start with kind of what you're doing, what the team's doing, and then how you got there personally, professionally, etc. And then we'll get into a couple of other things. So if you want to just tell us about what you're doing now, I know it's highly overlapping with the HDT team's work. So I'll just let you share whatever you wish is the best way for the audience to understand kind of what you're involved in. One thing I will say is that the audience is probably a little bit less life science heavy, right? So they may appreciate kind of a higher level overview, etc.
We're about a 4-year-old venture now. We develop RNA-based vaccines and therapeutics, HDT Bio. So at HDT Bio, we develop RNA vaccines and therapeutics with a team of about 40 people now, largely PhD scientists with specialties in virology and immunology and formulation chemistry, things like that. That platform is somewhat distinct from the traditional mRNA LNP vaccines that almost all of us got during the pandemic, in as much as we used kind of two fundamentally different components. The first is in the RNA itself. So we use something called a replicon RNA, which once it's delivered to your body, it actually makes copies of itself inside the host cell before initiating translation of the antigen protein. And that allows it to be more potent, therefore dose sparing, and therefore arguably have less side effects. And then the other component is, rather than using an LNP, which most of the other companies in this space use, which kind of wraps the RNA in a little bubble of fats to protect it, we use what's called a cationic nanoemulsion. And that's a very fancy word for just a little oil droplet that has some charge on the outside that allows us to wrap the RNA around the outside of the particle like a kind of like a rubber band on a ping pong ball or something like that. And so now you have this equally well stabilized and well formulated RNA molecule that gets delivered or injected just like you would the other vaccines, but happens to also stay local to the injection muscle and proximate lymph node, which allows us to mount, yes, a very strong immunological response against that antigen, but also even further still dampen the side effects and increase what we often refer to as the vaccine window. So the minimum dose level, thanks to that amplifying RNA, is quite low, and the tolerable dose level is comparatively high. So it's a really unique technology opportunity that we're developing. We've done some work in a number of infectious diseases, and we're just over the past 6 to 12 months beginning to expand the use of the technology into oncology as well.
Are the products already in production?
Yeah. The technology has borne vaccine products in, of course, the COVID vaccination space. We partnered with a number of companies around the world to advance clinical development of a COVID vaccine, like so many others during the pandemic. Those products, one such example, went on to receive emergency use authorization by way of a licensee in India. We ran clinical trials in Korea and Brazil and in the United States. Remains to be seen where that product goes in these territories, COVID being a somewhat complex marketplace at this stage of the pandemic/endemic, if you will. And then since then, we've also initiated product development in collaboration with BARDA and the DoD on a couple of other infectious disease areas of interest, one called Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, and another called the Nipah virus. These are more common in the global south and in fact in some certain territories endemic as well, and also on sort of the WHO's list of emerging infectious diseases, things that we want to keep an eye on as a global population, lest they become kind of like the COVID pandemic. And so we're developing those, enter clinical trials sometime late next year or in 25. And then a few named oncology products that we are in the earliest stages of development with key collaborators at University of Washington here in Seattle, Johns Hopkins, National Cancer Institute, and elsewhere.
Looks like a pretty exciting initiative. And how long has it been going on? And have you been there from the beginning?
Yeah, so HDT Bio is about 4 years old. Co-founded the company with Stephen Reed, Derek Carter, and a couple of other university faculty back in 2019. Was really drawn to their vision of not just developing disruptive technologies, but also really for them, decades of experience in working in global health and focusing the development of those novel technologies towards disease areas that are of relevance to global populations, and also maintaining a certain vigilance about the performance features of those technologies that they developed in order to be broadly applicable and accessible to those populations. One of the things we all, or many of us, heard about during the pandemic and the initial rollout of the mRNA LNP vaccines was the cold chain storage challenge. And as much as they required this minus 80 centigrade freezer storage that is only available at very large scale hospitals and things like that, manageable domestically, very, very challenging in a lot of other parts of the world. And so you would fly them into these countries. They'd have them sitting there on the tarmac or something like that, or in a holding facility, but there was no way to distribute them broadly across that territory and maintain storage, get the patients in the door, administer, and so on. And at the time, it really reminded me of pictures I had seen of the times when we were working towards eradication of polio. And in parts of the world, they would literally have horse-drawn carriages with giant blocks of ice and the vaccine sitting on top of them to try and keep them cold while they rode the cart out to these villages to vaccinate people. And, still we haven't quite eradicated polio as a population yet, but nevertheless, the desire was there, and so we found a way. And so I think one of the things we always have in our mind at HDT is how are we developing these technologies in a way that are not only going to address the sort of local need and demand, but also, or the pandemic preparedness, strategic national stockpiling, but in those parts of the world where these diseases are in fact endemic, how do we go in and make a difference in people's lives? And so we work closely with pharmaceutical developers in different parts of the world. We talk with the WHO and so on to make sure that we're taking those factors into consideration.
Just for, I guess, at least for my benefit and probably for some of the listeners, at an extremely high level as a consumer, right? Whenever a new product or solution comes into the market or marketplace, such as a vaccine or whether it's in healthcare or any kind of solution, really, it could be a consumer electronic widget. People want faster, better, cheaper, right? So all the hard work and complexity, complicatedness that your team's dealing with, right? And the global healthcare community is dealing with to work on this kind of a new paradigm or a new set of technologies to create and deliver vaccines. Are we getting all three of those?
I think so. Like day by day, look, the pandemic created this incredible opportunity space for demonstrating one of the principal utility features of RNA technologies, which is speed of response. You can almost always encode an antigen in nucleic acid faster than you can manufacture it as a protein. That is just kind of an inherent feature of RNA technology. So speed of response, strength of response or potency comes with the self-amplifying RNA, which we're developing, which just saw one of our peer companies, Arcturus, receive their first approval for a COVID vaccine in Japan. So we're seeing adoption of stronger, more potent RNA vaccines. And then, safety and performance, which also begets better. Yeah, because the safer you can be, the larger that vaccine window is, then the more different antigens you can encode and aggregate into a single shot. So you think about it, a lot of the childhood vaccines administered here in the United States and in other places abroad are like, think about like MMR, Tdap. These are vaccines that are intended to protect against 2, 3 different, not just antigens, but fundamentally different diseases, as compared to, say, your quadrivalent flu vaccine, which is really just protecting against one disease, just 4 different variants. So how do we get better and better at layering the encoding and the vaccine antigens upon one another to just give a patient one shot instead of, I have young kids, they probably had a dozen shots in the first couple of years of life, which is kind of crazy. So that also speaks to that sort of performance space that we continue to engineer in as a company and really as an industry. The responsiveness feature is I'll just say one more thing about the responsiveness, is still a grand challenge because it's not just about encoding the antigen. There remains speed of manufacture and distribution challenges. So we are engaged in a number of different collaborations to accelerate further still, not just the synthesis, but the manufacture, the packaging, the distribution, really because speed of response is only, it ought to be measured best by sort of awareness to direct patient intervention, not just awareness to vaccine product.
And I guess as a patient, it's the response after I get it in the bloodstream, right?
Yeah, that's a great example as well. Yeah, and indeed something that some of our federal government sponsors concern themselves with quite closely. If we're having a very acute outbreak of a particular virus in a particular part of the world, they want that speed of response so that they can send in frontline healthcare workers who are themselves protected as quickly as possible.
Right. Okay. So clearly it sounds like it's faster and it's better. Will these be cheaper?
That's a really good question. And one that is, for better or worse, always convolved with healthcare system and healthcare economics, which is definitely not my expertise nor our company's business. But what we can control on our side of the business is cost of goods, which again, RNA can afford a real step change in that space. And I think our particular version of the technology goes further still, that we can be upwards of 5 to 10x dose sparing in total drug dose is material when you're talking about dollars and cents at that scale, especially when you think about different markets around the world. And indeed, as we think about, one of our collaborations is in the veterinary health space, where the economics have even more downward pressure to be able to administer a vaccine to companion animal, to feed animal. And as global human population grows and the feed animal population grows proportionate to try and feed our growing population, it really is ripe for, as we saw during the pandemic, the speed of the spread of certain infections. And we saw indeed COVID spread through some animal populations. And there are all manner of, particularly influenza virus circulating. We've been in the throes of an ongoing sort of global avian flu outbreak, with particularly countries in Europe being challenged and trying to be responsive in feed animal populations. But there again, we're meeting the challenges of unit economics based on performance features in our vaccine.
Wow. Again, sounds, very exciting. Healthcare and just life sciences have been probably undergoing an evolution faster than Moore's law, which is what Silicon people are aware of or more conscious of, because that's where we work, or that's where a lot of our peers work. But it looks like in life sciences, there have been this kind of cliff type of breakthroughs, whether it's mRNA technology. Obviously, on the genetic side, there's CRISPR and CRISPR-based drugs and so on. But it's very exciting. Maybe this is a good way to ask you how you got into life sciences and why. What kind of prompted you? If you can maybe understand a little bit about Chris, the person. I understand you're from the Seattle area, or at least you've been here since young times, and then also you went to school elsewhere, and then you came back. Tell us the story.
Yeah, it's a great analogy, the Moore's Law reference, in as much as our industry, especially for myself, sort of coming of age around the time of the human genome sequencing process, especially in the Seattle area with luminaries like Lee Hood participating in that endeavor. So I was born in California, but grew up mostly in the Seattle area. Ended up going to undergrad at University of Washington.
The best school in the world, obviously.
Exactly. And Dr. Hood was there and started the Institute for Systems Biology, which was like, when you're 18, I barely knew that this stuff was going on. I was like loosely aware of it.
That's like being the founding of Microsoft or Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, kind of like, but being like across the street and only loosely aware it was going on. But what was happening there is exactly sort of what you described. Biology was beginning to appreciate that so much of what evolution has achieved is laid down in DNA and secondarily RNA and protein spaces as basically information that we were beginning to, at the time, work towards sequencing that information in order to better understand it. And indeed, the cost of sequence, the speed of sequencing has in many ways followed Moore's law in the last 25 years. Lagging just slightly behind is the speed and cost of gene synthesis. And when you combine those two things, it has been such an empowering toolkit. At the time, young scientists like myself who were coming up and being like, things that biologists would have spent an entire PhD thesis trying to accomplish, I would do in a month's time or something like that. And so by the time I left Seattle in 2006 and went to Cambridge to go to MIT to do my PhD, ordering genes was just kind of like a triviality. You entered it in to a portal on the internet, and a week later it showed up in the mail. And it was still relatively expensive, but that your average faculty's R01 budget could accommodate it meant that grad students could order genes and begin cloning and really doing what I went to MIT to do, which was like true biological engineering. There were bioengineering programs at the University of Washington, which was one of the first, as well as at Penn in like the 70s, but it wasn't like molecular engineering. And it wasn't until the sequencing and the synthesis began to track Moore's law of increases in speed and reductions in cost that we were able to really begin doing molecular engineering apace as an industry. And so by the time I'm a grad student, I'm cloning, swapping genes left and right, trying all different sorts of things. And so what I was really trained in technologically was protein engineering. Did some work in cancer therapeutic engineering, antigen binding, protein toxins, things like that. And then really at the time caught the sort of entrepreneurial bug. My dad in the Seattle ecosystem here had been in the sort of telecom sector and tech and had started companies. And I it's the sort of thing where like when you're a kid, he brings you to the office on the weekends or something like that. And you see the energy of this 10 or 20 person company and the people who are all there and the camaraderie that comes with being at a startup.
Sure.
And I think both my brother and I got pretty excited about that. And so by the time I'm at MIT, and as so many young academics will want to do, like, you sort of become a little bit jaded with the science itself and just being around the institute, started taking some classes at the business school, interacting with folks on that side of campus. As chance would have it, met a postdoc in the chemical engineering department, a Sloan business fellow, and started a synthetic biology company around the time I was wrapping up my PhD. So this would have been circa 2011 or so. We started a company called Manus Bio. Manus being the Latin root of manufacturing. Also part of the MIT slogan, mens et manus, mind and hand. And Manus Bio was really born of a technology that this postdoc had developed and paired with, my experience in protein engineering, which was then meant to be applied to enzyme engineering, wherein we were setting out, as many others were at the time and even somewhat before, to harness biology, in particular microbial biology, to manufacture different naturally occurring or chemically synthesized commercial goods. So spent about 4 or 5 years after my PhD in Cambridge area still building my first startup, building a team of, for me at the time, protein engineers, but also growing the company generally and sort of cutting my teeth on the business of building a company. And rather than doing an MBA, that was kind of like my in the field MBA.
On the job training. Got it.
I was blessed with a co-founding CEO who was gracious with his time and had started companies before, albeit not in biotech. So he had a really well-rounded perspective on what it meant to build a company generally. Because what I've come to experience through my own ventures and through interacting with other entrepreneurs across industries is that so many of the experiences have commonalities, and the challenges are quite similar when you're building a new venture. And so learned a lot about that. After I felt like I had built a team that was productive and supportive of the overarching mission of Manus Bio, really wanted to get back to the West Coast. Started spending more time in universities around here, talking to sort of early stage inventors and trying to find a match. And ultimately did move back here in 2016 to start a company out of the Institute for Protein Design, David Baker's institute, with a postdoc from his lab, a company called Vervio, which was attempting at the time to develop or advance the first truly de novo designed synthetic proteins. Aaron Chevalier, my co-founder there, was the co-first author on the first paper demonstrating de novo design of proteins. As a protein engineer, just an incredible feat. And we've seen David Baker's work and the Institute now, which really also started while I was an undergrad there, when I had an honors chemistry professor describe for the class the grand challenge of the protein folding problem, which is kind of like inverting the informatics space of gene sequencing and asking not just what is the sequence, but what does that sequence encode? How does it achieve the 3D architecture that then confers function? And David's group was really one of the leaders in the field of protein folding prediction. And it was only around the early teens where they published the first work in de novo enzyme design based on naturally occurring scaffolds. And then in around 16, first fully de novo proteins. While that venture didn't take off, we've now seen a slew of subsequent de novo protein companies come out of the Institute, including Neoleukin Therapeutics, and most recently acquired Icosavax. These are numerous examples of different use cases for synthetically designed proteins in our industry. So really exciting space. And so it was at the sort of tail end of that venture where I started looking once more out to like, what are the other opportunities, particularly in the Seattle region now that I was back here. It's such a great innovation ecosystem here in Seattle. We're not the biggest biotech hub in the country by any means, but between the UW School of Medicine, Institute for Systems Biology, Fred Hutch, Seattle Children's, we have so many incredible innovation centers here that there's always new technology sort of like percolating up, looking for the right opportunity to get onto that commercialization pathway and start to build something new. And it was around that time that an investor we both knew connected me and Steve and Derek. So, and the rest of HDT is history.
Awesome. I suppose, most entrepreneurs, they tumble around quite a bit before they achieve kind of success at scale, right? And maybe in some ways you're still working on it, or maybe we all are. Switching gears a little bit to the second piece of what we're going to talk about, right? And I think we've kind of covered part of one of the topics in the outline, which was success, right? Or what success has looked like in the past. Some of these ventures, getting your education done, obviously getting co-founders committed or joining a team of co-founders yourself. Those are all success points. Raising money, right? These are all success points, as well as getting product out the door. But the second part, which I'm sure played equally or maybe even more important part, which is setbacks, right? There's so many in everyone's journey, but especially in an entrepreneur's journey. I'd like to understand, how they occurred and what was the recovery mode or lessons and so on, and then how it eventually then again contributed to growth. The second part that I'm curious about is, now you're running a team. Well, I guess you've been running teams for a while, but what are your approaches to balancing risk versus taking some risk, right? So that you can actually grow. Every step you take that has any change involved is going to have risk because it may not work out for the positive. But at the same time, if you don't do it, then you'll die of complacency, right? Or you'll basically die from becoming irrelevant or non-current. I think you get the question.
I do. It's the death by equilibrium that I love. There's a classic biological truism somewhere in there between the difference equilibrium and steady state. Yeah, I'd like to think maybe I'm coming close to achieving career steady state where I know enough about myself and where I like to operate that I'm comfortable there. But certainly getting there has has not been easy. And you're right, there have been setbacks along the way, whether that's internal to a given venture or say along the sort of broader arc of my career. I would challenge one of the points you put forth at the outset of the question on definitions of success. So like our industry, in my opinion, I don't know that it's a popular opinion, spends too much time celebrating the act of raising capital. It is, in my perspective, but one way of building a company, and in that way, a requisite step, should you choose that path to building a venture. But it is not a definition of success for me. Like, because I've just seen too many ventures raise too much money in some cases and then do nothing with it, or, do something halfway and then ultimately, mismanage their way out of it. So
let me just, now that you've challenged, I view raising money as a validation step.
Totally.
Right? Obviously, money can be very bad for you in many ways, right? It can create bad habits. The investors you get in bed with can be not the best relationship, etc. And right, all kinds of things can happen. But to get somebody to write you a check, whether it's anywhere from $1 to $1 billion, means there's some kind of validation that has happened. So that's kind of how I say, okay, even if it's not, it certainly isn't the end in itself.
No,
right?
By no means.
Because ultimately the only dollar, Peter Drucker, who rest his soul, right? He was around a while ago. His saying was, there's only one profit center, right? And that is a customer that writes a check, an unbounced check, actually. He was very qualifying on that. And so I think ultimately that's the thing. But in healthcare, even that may be challenged a little bit, because in healthcare, there's a lot of work, effort being done, and it's been done since eternity by good Samaritans who don't necessarily view the relationship between the recipient as, being a customer and you being a supplier. I mean, you are a supplier, but the recipients, you're not doing it for money necessarily oftentimes. So maybe that's even challengeable. But going back to the larger points, help us understand kind of how failure in recovery, setbacks in recovery have been, helpful in growth.
Yeah. Internal to a venture, setbacks can be opportunities for you to reevaluate what it is you're building and why. And setbacks come in all kinds of forms, getting a no from an investor or an investor passing. And the best investors, in my experience, are those who are willing to give you feedback, even when they're saying no to that investment opportunity at the time, right? So you're learning, and those are minor little setbacks. And then you have setbacks of the direct customer variety, kind of like you were talking about. So all of these data points give you the opportunity within the context of a singular venture to kind of fine tune, or to use the classical jargon, pivot, maybe not to that grand of magnitude, but there has been a lot of that in each of my ventures. I would say that it's actually the venture that failed is the one that provided me as an entrepreneur in my broader arc the most learning opportunities, because when you succeed, you may have had some minor setbacks along the way, but what you found is the set of decision or pivot points that led you to success. You plotted that one path that arrived at success. And maybe you tried a few other paths along the way that you sort of returned to the course by way of feedback. But when a venture fails, while you're engaged with it, you are trying every single different path to try and make it successful. And so you experience a lot more different ways and this is true of science as well. Yeah. Most PhD scientists will have experienced this during their first year or two in the lab. You will try every single different way to try and test your hypothesis or get your engineered system to work or outperform a given standard, and they'll all fail. None of them will work. But every single one of them is a learning, no different than the sort of course correction learnings that happen on the trajectory or path of a ultimately successful company.
Sure.
The difference in the failure is that you just tried over and over. You tried so many different ways to arrive at the solution space. And so I certainly don't look at my time working on my second venture as any type of wasted time. I built incredibly valuable relationships by way of trying all of those different modes, and learned so much about the industry, the product and technology space that we were operating in, things that I may not directly apply in my own career thereafter, but I can also provide that feedback and knowledge into the ecosystem and into the founders of subsequent ventures operating in the same technology or market space. I think it's a great feature of entrepreneurial communities in that those feedback loops do exist, and the mentorship opportunities are generally well engaged upon, as opposed to the sciences where so many of those negative results are never communicated because we don't have a journal of failed science for a number of different reasons, which we don't need to get into here. But like, so when you are stepping into the grad school laboratory for the first time, yeah, maybe you have an experienced postdoc sort of showing you some of the basic tools of operating in the lab. But as you're exploring sort of biological space or bioengineering space, you're doing so fairly blindly, save for, the success of the demonstrations. And I think, a lot of higher level entrepreneurial data is also somewhat biased in that way. We get the super entrepreneurial luminary held up as, oh, this is what you should try and be. And it's like, yes, but that's such a unique edge case that I think we would be better served teaching young MBA students, young scientists who are entrepreneurial minded, that like the median entrepreneurial outcome or effective operator is something slightly different than that.
Well, the good news is people get educated really fast as soon as they try it.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
It doesn't take you 10 years to figure out that most of the things you're doing are not going to actually get you to where you want to go. So maybe life has a way of balancing things.
Yeah. So I didn't answer the last part of your question. Sorry to interrupt you. So you asked about running a team and balancing risk, right? And so, I mentioned HDT Bio is now 40 people. I run a team that is a subset of that. And we balance this type of growth and risk decisions as many do in our industry. And we are in a relatively unique financing mode at HDT Bio, wherein that risk is fairly significantly mitigated. We've been fortunate enough over our short lifetime here to identify sort of customer fit with the US federal government and their, especially in the wake of pandemic, desire to achieve pandemic preparedness and embrace technologies that facilitate the same. And so we have secured somewhere in the ballpark of like $90 million in federal government grants and contract commitments. Now, that's not realized overnight. You have to earn out milestones and success, and exactly. But what it does is it creates a fairly stable operating basis to grow your company. Because when I hire a new scientist at the behest of one of these grants or contracts, their salary doesn't increase our burn rate. Their salary is reimbursed by the government in order to execute upon this grant or contract. No different than a academic lab. So a lot of our growth has been driven by that. That's not to say we haven't run independent initiatives at HDT. We do have a burn rate like almost any other growing biopharmaceutical venture. To your point about raising money, and we have raised money from investors as well, but we are walking that path hand in hand with our federal government partners to not only bring product to patients ultimately, but to also help our technology achieve the platform level validation and create the both temporal and operating space for us as a company to try and pattern match with the real customer for a lot of early stage biotech, which is big pharma. So how do I collaborate as an early stage sort of sell side business development person with my counterparts at the big pharma companies to understand what is on mission for them from a disease perspective, and where can our technology, given its performance features, be most relevant? And that's where opportunities at HDT, it's about where are we going to take our non-reimbursable dollars and put them to work trying to go out and entice our ultimate customer, if not the end user, that our platform is the thing that's going to solve that problem.
I see. So in that part of the business, or that portion of the business in some ways, so do people feel empowered to take some risk themselves, or is it a fairly top-down approach within the team?
No, so that's the beauty of sort of what I was describing, this relationship with the federal government sponsorship, is we hire these team members to execute on the various awards and contracts. But we do try and create the space for them to use a fractional amount of their time to do what I sometimes refer to as like blue sky work. If I'm an immunologist at HDT, 80% of my time is executing on this contract and delivering data to whatever agency is funding my work. 20% of my time is, okay, I'm going to run this experiment out of pure curiosity, or I'm going to try this new vaccine design in this other disease area that I think is interesting or that our business has identified as interesting. And that contributes to the body of knowledge related to our platform, which we continue to learn about at the molecular level across different species with respect to the underlying immunology. And we continue to engineer new innovations in the platform that we then, of course, go on to patent and build a larger and larger portfolio of value at HDT. And I think the same could be said of how I think about running the operations team here. You know, we have, by way of the business model that we've built to date, 80% of their time is spent executing on that business model, finishing up, like closing out contracts, renegotiating contracts, working with our government counterparts on basically how we operate as a government contractor, which is a non-trivial operating mode. I mean, there are multi-billion-dollar companies that operate exclusively in that mode across different agencies. Now, that's not our exclusive mode, but it is the foundational mode of our company. So the majority of my team's time is focused on servicing that mode. And then 20% of their time is, how do I mature our organizational performance in a way that lets us take the next step as a company to continue to grow, to get better in one dimension or another. You know, not every early stage venture is going to have that same balance necessarily, depending on the relative maturity of the technology in question. But I think as you grow, I've always tried really hard to maintain some balance, because I think there is a human desire to have some balance to that. I think about my grandparents and the type of work that they did, or even before them. You know, workers were more or less treated like machines. They came into a job at 9, they did the exact same thing for 8 straight hours, maybe with a break for lunch, and then they went home. And especially in this sort of modern era, and if you work in a high-tech industry, what I've sometimes heard referred to as the knowledge worker cannot suffer that type of indignity. You know, you have to give these incredibly intelligent and thoughtful and highly trained individuals some space to exhibit creativity, to apply themselves, to explore the unknown or build, even within a niche, the niche aspect of the business that they are accountable. Because if all you do is ask them to come in every day and turn the crank, they come in, they turn a crank, and they get a check to pay their bills with. Like, come on, that's no way to live.
There's multiple, I guess, similarities in our value or set of expectations with knowledge workers, but I would say expand that to humans, right, in general, because most humans are learnable, teachable. And so there's always potential for growth as far as what they're doing today versus what they can do tomorrow and so on. So at High Tech Advisors, the practical way we describe our business is that we're experts at engaging experts on behalf of the clients, right? And as I mentioned briefly, I think yesterday, we're doing more and more work in the healthcare and kind of life sciences vertical. Once we discover or understand what the client's problems are, right, we're really good at figuring out which experts will be relevant and also how to get them excited about the problem. But it ties to a broader motto that we have, is that we like to map meaningful problems to people who find them meaningful to solve, right? And so whoever's walking in your building as a leader, your job is to make sure that every day they go home, they feel rewarded, right? Not just the how many cranks did you do for the business and how much, money is in your check, right? It's the feeling rewarded, feeling satisfied or content, and feeling like you're growing has multiple components. Of course, practicalities have to be taken care of, right? If you're not able to pay your mortgage or be able to buy groceries, that'll create a lot of stress. So you got to address those and make sure that's addressed. But on top of that, it's like, how can you reach further and higher? Another component I wanted to touch on, you mentioned a lot of the endeavors and steps in your journey so far, and they sound very exciting, but I'm sure they were super, super demanding physically, energy-wise, time-wise, etc. Earlier, we were talking about 2 family members you have under 2, and I'm assuming, like all the rest of us, you probably care about your health. there's other family members, there might be some causes, there might be what have you, right? So how have you traveled the journey of life, balanced the professional and the personal so that you're growing as well as finding satisfaction?
Yeah, I mean, I've always tried to maintain that balance. I've often thought about that balance in terms of like pillars, and you describe them fairly consistently in terms of your professional work, family and friends, and then the personal, sort of how you take care of yourself. And yes, that can be physically, that can be psychologically, and I definitely tried to maintain that balance as you point out, the nature of each of those pillars changes over time. What company or technology I'm working on at the time, who my closest friends or family are at a given time, new friends and family coming into the picture from time to time changes how you balance, what that balance looks like, what you're doing in the parts of every day, perhaps in those parts of your time that you attribute to each of those pillars. And then the personal, I have my personal hobbies, most of which involve some physical activity to try and maintain physical health, and but the psychological as well. Look, the psychological is I think an area of growing appreciation amongst entrepreneurs in terms of the toll that it takes on the solo founder or just early founders in general, the isolation that can sometimes come with that, and the challenging association that one is really challenged not to make between yourself and the venture. Like, is my value interwoven with people's perception of the value of this venture? When a company or its growth is going well, that's great, right? That's easy. There's nothing wrong with that because you're on an upward trajectory. When it's not, or when you have those setbacks, that's when it can be really hard. And I think I kind of learned the hard way that I had to dissociate the two, that my personal perception of myself, how the world perceives me, the value that I create as an individual is not inherently tied to this particular venture, this or that setback or success. What that has allowed me to do, and it's definitely a continuous learning process there, is to be a bit more even keeled as you build something from nothing into perhaps something grand, because there are always those setbacks. And as you receive feedback, one of the things that I think challenges younger entrepreneurs is being too responsive. We were talking about those setbacks and course corrections or pivots. Being too responsive to every piece of feedback is a challenge for early stage entrepreneurs. And so being more even keeled, not just for yourself, like emotionally and psychologically, but also in your venture. Having a ballast can be really important.
Right. No, that's a very astute point. Most seasoned entrepreneurs end up becoming less judgmental. It's just like playing football or pick your sport, right? The seasoned players are not going to be too judgmental because ultimately it is just one game or one play. And you could have won it, lost it. Sometimes playoffs are tied to it. Championships can be tied to it. But everything is one game, right? Or one play. And it can go good or bad, I suppose. And so this actually is kind of a interesting thing that I've experienced in conversations, right? Where, like you're saying earlier also, that the accolades are more in the news, this and that entrepreneur or team, business, etc. When they achieve success, they're in the news, and nobody sees the dead ends and the failures that they experience as well as a whole bunch of other business teams and people in general experience. In terms of raising your awareness and growth, it's actually the discovery of the dead ends that actually gives you a bigger picture of the map, literally, right, of all the paths. And that's where true growth and kind of true awareness comes from. And so similarly, this psychological kind of maybe maturation, I don't know what it is, where you don't take success at wildly upward valuation and you don't take a failure at a wildly downward valuation, right? Because the other analogy is sprint versus marathon, right? Life's a marathon. And so you can't run out of steam by getting too excited or too depressed.
Yeah, and if you try and sprint too long, you'll burn yourself out. And that, I think, can be said of ventures, it can be said of teams, and it can be certainly said of individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, at any unit. So going back to one of the things you mentioned, so are there things, activities, hobbies, cycling, I don't know what you might be doing, that kind of, help you just rejuvenate, if not actually, feel better after maybe what may appear to be a setback, or calmer after what may appear to be a success, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. No, I'm a big soccer player.
Oh,
Try to do that fairly regularly, once, twice a week, something like that. Sport has this incredible effect on the player, not so much the observer, in my experience, that when you're playing, and especially if it's a sport you've played for a long time, you kind of stop thinking and you just kind of do. The flow of play affects you and you respond to it. You respond to the other players on the field. You respond to the ball or whatever. I deeply appreciate the time that I have to take away and step onto the field and not think for a little bit, because in the other pillars of my life, at HDT, at home, so much of my time I am on. I'm engaging with other people. I'm thinking about what the next steps are, and there's really no turning off, save for when I'm asleep. And even then, I feel like in my dreams, I'm thinking about whatever happened recently or what have you. But no, man, when you're on the field, it's a chance to turn off. So I do a fair bit of that. I regret I don't sail as often as I used to, which is a hobby I also enjoy, but one that is rather time consuming, especially if you have young kids. And bringing young kids on the water is always a risk as well. But nevertheless, things like that have always been a really nice escape for me psychologically. And as you point out, sort of adding a little bit of a damping effect on whatever happened recently, right? Up, down, sideways, whatever, is like, if I go play for a couple hours, I'll come back being like, oh yeah, that's right. That thing happened. It's not that big a deal. Let me now reset my thinking about whatever it was or its context, and then, set back.
but one of the things that a few guests raised in our earlier episodes was it wasn't fair that only I asked the questions, right? And
Sure.
so we've added this as an opportunity for you and guests in general to ask me anything, maybe based on today's conversation or based on something we might have discussed earlier, or just anything you might be curious about. I'm happy to. You kind of know, or what I do, our business. So is there anything you want to ask?
One thing we haven't talked about, even though I think we share some perspective around it, is, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, is sort of like what it means to be in this particular ecosystem. Because I think you and I maybe experience it a little bit differently, but because I've been operating here as an entrepreneur for 7 years now or so, almost 8.
Here, as in geographically
Yeah,
here?
sorry. See, I'm talking about Seattle specifically. And I saw, as I was saying before, my dad started companies here. So I've seen the sort of energy of this place. And I don't know how, or if at all it's tied to the weather, the geography, the spirit of this place. I mean, if you go all the way back to like the original inhabitants of this part of the world, ever since I moved here from California, I've been fascinated by this place. And I can identify geologically similar, like if you've ever been to Switzerland, like Switzerland always reminds me of the Pacific Northwest, the water and the mountains and things like that. It's not quite the same, right? There's something about the spirit of this place. So I'd just be curious, like how you've experienced and perceived this ecosystem.
Sure. I mean, it's a big question. I mean, if you're looking for the causation, right, that's a big question as to, okay, there's been a lot of success in Seattle economically, maybe even academically and intellectually. You can count many, many ventures from Boeing, Costco, Starbucks, Microsoft, Eddie Bauer, REI, Amazon, UW, and the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, the Gates Foundation, Path. I mean, there's so many things that are going on here that are like world class in their respective domains, right? This is my thinking around these things. I guess it's probably from the same sources that you get your information around. Once you have critical mass, it's easy for things to keep happening because that's the definition of critical mass, right? You have the chain reaction going. Whereas what would have gotten the critical mass in Seattle? And that probably has to do with very foundational things like being a port, the weather. Geographically, you're in a place. This is the closest place in continental US to Asia by ship, right? So that has a huge influence on outside ideas and people and things like that, right? And so it's probably a confluence of these things. culturally, right, since the time I've been here, one of the things that's really good that I think contributes to entrepreneurs and people being successful in general, people are very generous with spending time with people. So once I discover that you're committed to something, if I've had experience in that domain and you come to me with any questions, in Seattle, generally you'll get that time with people, right? So I think role models, generous mentors, I think that contributes. Research institutions are critical to ecosystems like ours. So University of Washington, as well as a whole bunch of other institutes that you mentioned, especially in the life sciences ecosystem, that are valuable, right? They kind of add to the critical mass, I think. And then money. Money is a big factor, right? So you need some money at some point. Now we have money, at least in the last few decades, from the earlier ventures, right? That came before you and I probably showed up on the scene. I think these are some of the things that I think might be even obviously known. But one thing I think sometimes, especially the people in the tech ecosystem, forget, because they're so proud of innovation and no regulation and we know what's best, is that in most of the areas of the US where there is innovation going on, the biggest instigator is actually the federal government. And people, it's like regulation people don't like government, and these things are there. But if you go back to Silicon Valley, right, how did Silicon Valley happen? If you say who is the biggest reason, it's the federal government. And in your business, you already talked about how the federal government is a huge part of it, or right, you may not even exist without it, right? So I think in Silicon Valley, right, in World War II, they're making a lot of researching and making weapons and a bunch of other things. The electronics industry and a lot of the military industrial complex was based in California. And I think that was a huge component. So maybe that's one of the things, one of the roles that, one of the actors that we may not credit enough, even in the Seattle ecosystem. If you go to the research institution of a UW, right, obviously they're the biggest publicly funded university with the biggest funding from the federal government, actually, right? And you might have heard that somewhere. I don't have a crisp, clear answer, but I think maybe that's a slightly non-traditional answer, which is what is the role of government in innovation or this hub that we have in Seattle? Personally, I think the weather plays a huge role.
I'd agree with that. Because and I think that the government involvement is difficult to dispute. I mean, it's so foundational. When you have these hubs of innovation, they are anchored in academic institutions almost universally, whether you're talking about Seattle or the Bay Area or Cambridge, the DC area, Hopkins, the National Institutes and so on, all largely government funded. And that's where the innovation comes from. Those agencies have become more and more translationally focused. So they want to more and more sponsor work that is thoughtful about what its long-term implications and potential for impact are. So no, huge credit to those. I would pull on that thread of critical mass a little bit and wonder, there are lots of population centers and even ports around the United States that don't have this same culture or concentration of not just human population, but I think I saw somewhere at one point that the Seattle metro area has the highest proportion of higher education degree holders in the United States. Why? Why should that be the case? I can see the chicken and egg of it, that Microsoft and Amazon and Boeing and Weyerhaeuser and whoever are here. There is now a gravitational pull. But those things started here. I can't totally wrap my head around. The thing that gets me up in the morning, gets most of the people up here at HDT is this faith that the thing we're building together is worth pursuing and is eminently possible to achieve should we continue to get up every morning and come together and work towards it. And I think this is true of so many industries here in Seattle and for early stage ventures around the world, is just keep getting up, keep getting 1% better every single day. And, in spite of those setbacks, we'll get to somewhere really exciting together.
Wow. Well, that's a great way to wrap up our conversation. Keep the faith, right?
Keep the faith. Exactly. Thank you, Haresh. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Chris.
All right. Bye now.